falling apart. According to the theory of evolution, approximately 4.5 billion years ago, the first signs of life on Earth appeared. It was a single-cell organism, and like all living things, it had the ability to reproduce itself. Before long, the Earth's oceans were teeming with them. Then, around 2 billion years ago, some of these single cells began to merge together and formed the first multi-cell organism. From that time on, life began to evolve into more complex and various kinds of life forms. And scientists have cataloged this evolutionary path, linking one kind of species that has evolved into a different kind. According to them, these changes took place over millions of years as one form of animal slowly morphed into another one. According to evolutionists, we can see this change more clearly when we study the evolution of man. From the evidence that science has acquired, it's now believed that our race started from chimpanzees, and over the next 5 million years, they've slowly transitioned from one form of humanoid to a more advanced form, until, around 600,000 years ago, the first truly human being was born. But how did this change take place? According to the theory of evolution, these changes came about primarily from genetic mutations. Now, to understand what they are, we have to understand what genes are. Inside the nucleus of every cell, both plant and animal, there is something called deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA for short. That's a long string of chemicals that resembles a twisted ladder with rungs. And it's the arrangement of those rungs, known as nucleotides, that determines what each plant and animal will be like. This long ribbon of DNA is tightly wrapped together in what is called a chromosome. And every animal has chromosomes, but they have different number of chromosomes. In humans, we have 24 sets of chromosomes, with each one consisting of one from our mother and one from our father. However, each set of chromosomes contains a different group of instructions known as genes. Just before a cell begins to divide, it makes an exact duplicate of every set of chromosomes, thereby creating 48 sets. But as the cell begins to divide, half of the chromosomes go into the new cell, and the other half remains in the parent cell. When this division is complete, both cells then contain the same 24 sets of chromosomes. However, every so often when a cell makes a copy of its chromosomes, it makes a mistake. And when that happens, the chromosomes are not exactly the same as the original. We call that change a mutation. And when that happens, it also changes the instructions that were contained on the original chromosomes. 99% of the time, this change in instruction has a negative or no effect. But according to evolutionists, every so often this mutation produces a positive effect, meaning that it helps the animal to better adapt to its environment. When this happens, it helps that particular animal survive better than the other animals of its own species. And as it reproduces, its offspring are able to flourish better than others. This is known as survival of the fittest. But how exactly does this happen? The rungs of a DNA ladder are made of only 4 chemicals, and we can think of each rung as a letter. A gene is one small part or segment of the long DNA strand that's contained in a chromosome. Even so, a gene can contain 1,000 or more rungs or letters. It is those letters that spell out the instructions of how a particular part of the body is to be made and how it's to function. If just one rung is changed during the duplication process, it can cause a change in how the instructions are read. And according to evolutionists, it is those changes in instruction that account for how one animal is able to eventually change into a different kind of animal. However, there's a problem with that theory. To understand what the problem is, we have to understand what the genetic instructions actually say. Instead of each rung being a letter, 3 rungs are read together which identify a particular kind of amino acid. And it is the sequence of how those amino acids are put together that identify a particular kind of amino acid. And it is the sequence of how those amino acids are put together in what is called a peptide change that determines what kind of a protein it becomes. And a peptide chain can contain 1,000 or more amino acids that all have to be in a very precise sequence. If just one of those amino acids is in the wrong place, then the protein either doesn't work or does something it wasn't supposed to do. However, that's just the first step of the process. Once the chain has been completed, then it is folded and formed into a particular shape, and it's the shape of a protein that determines what it can do. Furthermore, folded peptide chains can be linked together to form a larger protein. But if the peptide chain doesn't contain the right sequence of amino acids, then it won't be able to fold into the proper shape. Everything in our body is made of protein. The 6 different systems in our bodies, including bones, nerves, arteries, blood, and more, are all made from protein. It's the sequence of how these amino acids are put together and how the peptide chains are folded that determines what kind of muscle cells will be made and how those cells will fit together and work together. It's the genes that determine the kind of proteins that are needed to make every organ in our body and what function that organ will perform. If there is a mutation or a change in just one rung of one gene, then the required protein will either be missing or will be different. Evolutionists say that it is when a beneficial mutation occurs that accounts for how one animal changes into another. But there's a problem with that theory. When we look at the eye, we don't just see one blob of muscle, but instead we see many different parts that are all needed to work together in a very precise manner. For that to happen, it takes hundreds of genes just to take all of the components and put them together in just the right size and position. Then it requires thousands of genes working together to make the eye actually work. If we look at the heart, it takes about 200 genes just to make the core element. Then it takes another 300 genes to make the heart muscles and have them contract. Then it takes another 500 genes to form the blood vessels. And then it takes another 1,000 genes to produce the metabolism, mitochondrial function, and repair. In all, it takes 2,000 to 3,000 genes to make the heart and have it actually work. If we look at something as simple as our skin, which is made of protein, it takes more than 2,000 genes just to build the epidermis. Then there are genes needed to produce keratins, collagens, elastin, pigmentation, regulatory genes, and immune and healing genes. In all, to make the human skin requires nearly 10,000 different types of genes. But it's more complicated than that. A bacteria cell is the simplest form of a living organism, and it contains many different parts, all of which requires protein. In all, In order for the cell to function, it requires 4,000 to 5,000 different kinds of genes. In the human body, we have many different types of cells, but typically, a human cell can have anywhere between 10,000 to 20,000 different types of proteins needed in order for it to function. What this tells us is that having an accidental change of one or two rungs on one gene isn't going to create a major change in the way an animal looks or behaves. For that to happen would require a great number of positive changes to be made to a large number of genes all at the same time. To put this in perspective, a frame house requires hundreds of 2x4 studs that all need to be cut individually to a precise dimension. And the same goes for cutting floor and ceiling joists. Roof trusses not only have to be individually cut to the right size, but also to the right angle. If we imagine each piece of wood as being a gene, it is impossible to make a change to one or two pieces of wood that would dramatically change the shape of a house in a positive way. If anything, it would make the house look worse rather than better. The theory of evolution rests primarily on the assumption that all changes are ultimately the result of genetic mutation. But when we look more closely at their theory, it falls apart.